You'll all be familiar with the Bible story of Abraham and Isaac. A version of the same tale is in the Quran, and Abraham and Isaac are not the only characters recognisable in Jewish, Christian and Muslim texts. Dr. Andy Bannister, a specialist in Islamic studies, is director of the Solace Centre for Public Christianity, a charity based in Scotland. I asked him about the similarities between the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam.
Do you know, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Judaism and Christianity, share a lot, not least all the first Christians were Jewish. Jesus was a Jew, so there's a very strong connection there. Islam, something slightly different is going on. There's about a 600-year time gap between Jesus, between New Testament times, and Muhammad. But when Muhammad starts preaching and teaching the material that comes to be written down as the Quran, there's a lot of biblical influences there. Historians think that's because there were Jewish communities, Christian communities there in Arabia. Jewish and Christian material, biblical stories is circulating around in the Arabia of Muhammad's day, and that's left its influence there in the Quran. And so it's often a surprise to Christian and Jewish readers that biblical stories turn up on the pages of the Quran, told sometimes differently, but clearly, sharing that kind of common influence.
Well, where can you see it specifically?
So let me give you some examples. Take Jesus, for example. About 90 verses of the Quran concern Jesus. Most of
Out of how many verses altogether?
About 6,200. So not a huge amount, but a significant amount, especially when you realise that Muhammad himself is only mentioned in the Quran by name probably twice. So quite a difference there. And then you have biblical figures like Moses and Abraham turns up. The story of Jonah and the whale, well-known story there in the pages of the Quran. I did some work on in my own kind of doctoral work is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's told 7 times in the Quran in slightly different forms. So a lot of biblical stories can be found there.
So what are the differences in the Adam and Eve story? Not just the differences between the different versions in the Quran, but the differences with, say, the story that Christians know.
Yeah, there's certainly the basic shape of the story is the same. So Adam and Eve are created, there's the forbidden fruit, they eat of that, and consequences follow. But there's also some small but actually significant differences. One of the big differences is, in the biblical story, Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden when they eat of the forbidden tree. In the Quran, they're cast down from the garden. God, Allah, in the Quran says, get down from here to the earth, which will be a place of trial and testing for you. And it becomes clear in the Quran that Adam and Eve are actually created in paradise. The Garden of Eden is upstairs, as it were. And the reason that we're down here on earth as human beings is because of the sin of our first ancestors. And that has some interesting consequences when you think about it. Whereas in Jewish and Christian tradition, the earth is where we're supposed to be. This is God's good creation. It's where God made for us to be. Yes, it's broken and damaged. Some things have gone wrong, and the Bible talks about that. But there's that difference there in the Quran about where creation took place. Those are some pretty severe consequences when you work those through.
Are the festivals and things that are commemorated similar in any way? I know fasting is big in all three monotheistic religions, but we've just had the Muslim festival of sacrifice.
That's right. So the Muslim festival of sacrifice, exactly, of Eid, comes at the end of Ramadan, which is, many listeners who even haven't thought much about Islam may have heard of the 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 practices that you have to do to be an Orthodox Muslim. And one of those is fasting during the Muslim month of Ramadan. At the end, they have this great festival of Eid. Now, that's very interesting because Eid celebrates a story that, again, occurs in both the Bible and the Quran, which is the story of how Abraham takes his son to the top of the mountain, is commanded by God to sacrifice him. And just as Abraham's about to, the knife is about to fall, God says, okay, don't kill him. This is a test of your faith. And actually, I'll provide a sacrifice in the place of your son, and a ram is provided, and Muslims celebrate that by sacrificing, by killing a ram, having this feast at the end of Ramadan. Now that story is common to Judaism, Christianity and Islam. It does raise some interesting questions because Islam has generally tried to do away with the whole concept of sacrifice. It rejects the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross for human sin and wrongdoing, for instance, but there are still shadows of that biblical idea, and Eid is one of them. Of course, fasting is something Jews do, Christians do, sometimes too, but it's not quite as central in those faiths as it would be in Islam.
These stories that show a similarity between Christianity, Judaism and Islam, are there similar stories in other non-monotheistic religions, in other faiths that are to do with, sacrifice, that are to do with being cast out from paradise and so on?
Yes and no. I think you can find in some of the other sort of religious traditions of the world some stories that have the same themes. One of the reasons being, I think, when people kind of sort of reach out spiritually, there are certain things they'll land upon. Fasting would be a good example. But one of the big differences, I think, but certainly between Judaism and Christianity, and to a lesser extent Islam, and then faiths like Buddhism and Hinduism, is that those first three that I mentioned would be historically grounded. By which I mean, take Christianity, for example. If Jesus of Nazareth did not walk the dusty streets of Palestine in the first 3 decades of the first century, die on a cross and rise from the dead, Christianity is useless. It stands or falls on history. If that great revelatory moment for Jews at Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments didn't happen in history, Judaism is nothing more than a fairy tale. And of course, for Muslims, if Muhammad didn't live and preach in history, they have a problem. And so the great thing I think about Judaism and Christianity and Islam is they're historically verifiable. You can set out and try to test them historically and see if they stand up.
I wondered if there was something in the human psyche, perhaps, that leads religions to have these similarities.
I think a number of things would lead me to conclude yes. One of the things being that that every religion, I think, recognises that something has gone wrong with the human condition. That's a kind of universal idea. And I think that's for a very good reason. Look around the world and to go, there is a problem. And I can point you to many, atheist and secular thinkers who would say, actually, in describing in something like the biblical story of the fall, for example, that Christianity and Judaism, and of course to a lesser extent Islam, are onto something here. There is clearly something awry. You only have to open the newspaper to see this is the case. Then I think where the major religions of the world differ is, what is that? And how do you put it right? Islam's approach to life is really saying, look, the problem with the human condition is God has given us moral commands. We've forgotten them. The solution is more moral commands. And if you keep enough of them, you can kind of earn your way upwards. Judaism operates on a sort of related model. I think what has long intrigued me about Christianity is that it does take a slightly different approach, saying that actually, no matter how hard we work from our side, we can't claw our way upwards, because actually our problem is that we can't measure up to God's standards, let alone our own. And what we need is grace. We need something from God's side of the equation, which is what the Bible, the New Testament claims God did it in and through Jesus. But this idea that there's something that needs transforming within us, I think is universal to the world's religions. The question is, what is it, and what's the solution?
Were you brought up a Christian, Andy?
I was raised in a Christian home. And then around about sort of 13 or 14 began questioning things and really not finding the answers I was given in the church I was raised much help as a thinker, and so began diving into philosophy and particularly history. And then the moment for me that's really changed things was when I first began encountering Muslim friends in London in the 1990s. I began going to a place in London called Speaker's Corner, kind of the world centre of free speech, it's sort of famously known as. And I found Muslims there who were not just well trained in their own faith, they were well trained in abolishing Christians. And I faced objections and questions about my faith I'd never even considered, and really came quite close to throwing it all in. Because for me, what I wanted to know is what's true. And that sent me really into researching, into reading, into thinking, eventually leading to a PhD in Islamic studies, because I wanted to pursue some of these questions down. And to me, I did a long kind of circular journey, talk about pilgrimage really, coming back to realizing, I had the confidence that the things I was raised in were true, but not perhaps for the reasons I was given back then. And to me, the most important question in all of this is what's true? If Christianity is true, you should believe it. If it's false, you should reject it. The same goes for Islam, same goes for atheism, same goes for all the great faith and belief traditions.
Can they all be true?
Not really. I mean, because to go at the end of the day, where they fundamentally contradict, we hit a problem. I mean, take something so simple as the question: was Jesus crucified? The Gospels, the New Testament says yes. Actually, most historians say yes. Most historians working on first century issues will tell you the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most certain events of first century history, for reasons we don't have time to go into, I imagine. The Quran, though, in the 4th chapter, verse 157, denies that Jesus was crucified. Well, those can't both be true, can they? He can't both have been crucified by the Romans and not crucified by the Romans. One of those claims has to be true. And so I think we can put religious claims to the test in the same way that we can scientific claims or ethical claims or other claims, and investigate them. And the reason we have to is they matter. You see, I think I'm passionate that the question of who God is and how he's revealed himself or not is one of the most important things we can think about as human beings. It changes everything. It's not just a mere fact about the universe. And so I think it's important to pursue it, to pursue truth, to put the things you believe to the test, whether you're a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim, to ask, are the things that I believe true? And if they're not, be willing to follow the evidence where it leads.
Are you still questioning then, Andy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the joys of my job is I, almost every day, are dialoguing with people of all faiths and none. And in fact, the most recent book I wrote, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, wasn't on Islam, it was on atheism. And, lots of Christians sort of make snide remarks about the likes of Richard Dawkins and others. I love that kind of form of atheism, those very confident atheism that we've seen in the last few years, because it's forced me to think, and I love being challenged. So yeah, I'm still thinking. There are questions that I had when I was younger that I've resolved. There are questions I have that I'm still working on, and I love engaging with those who think differently, because if we only talk to those who think the same as us, we're living in an echo chamber, and our thinking's not going to be challenged, right?
Dr. Andy Bannister.